So a new Hearthstone expansion has been revealed. It is Perils in Paradise, and looks like we're going on vacation. This is kind of a beach resort themed expansion alongside some pirates and such. It's got the return of Marin the Fox, as you can see. And we got a lot of interesting cards to talk about. We got treasures and pirates and tourist cards, which is kind of like a new way to do dual class stuff. We'll talk about it. But some very interesting designs in this video. Now, before I start, I just want to say, like, I know there's a meme that I don't really play Hearthstone anymore, which was probably true a year ago with, you know, having a daughter kind of up in my life. But for the last 4 months, I've actually been playing more standard Hearthstone than probably anybody realizes, and probably more than I've played at any given point in the last 5 years. I've actually been sitting in top 1000 legend for 2 months in a row. I've had 11-star bonuses while climbing, so I've actually been playing a lot of standard Hearthstone in my off hours, just not making a ton of videos. So I do feel actually relatively well equipped to discuss these cards, at least in their current contexts. So that said, let's go ahead and kick it off here with kind of the marquee new legendary, which is actually apparently in the game right now. You can play this one as we speak. And Marin the Manager here is a 7-mana 6/6. This time around he's a pirate, and it sounds like pirates might be a bit of a sub-theme in this expansion with some synergies and stuff, so keep that in mind. He's also got Battle Cry. Choose a fantastic treasure. Shuffle the other 3 into your deck. So with the old Marin the Fox, you know, you had to do some work to get your treasure. He was an 8-mana 6/6, and you had to kill that 0/8 treasure chest to get the treasure in that case. And I think you just got one random one, right? But with this, you just get the treasure right away, and you get to pick which one you want, and you still get the other 3 added to your deck as well. So this is just like 1,000 times stronger version of the old Marin the Fox, which was a pretty tough card to get value from back in the day, as I recall. But these are the 4 treasures. You'll remember they do look like they're the same as they used to be. I think Wondrous Wand in particular looks really strong, right? Just drawing cards, getting some high cost stuff reduced to 0 could be crazy powerful. If you need some immediate tempo, you got the Xerog's Crown, can get you some bodies, or maybe, you know, dig for a crazy out. The Golden Kobold can take perhaps junk in your hand and turn it into valuable stuff. But as we know, random legendaries can be pretty hit or miss. And then the Goblet actually could be pretty interesting. It's probably going to be hard to do anything reliably crazy with that, but sometimes you might just get some absolutely absurd thing where, you know, you draw a 0 cost card and fill your hand with copies of it, or burn damage, or whatever cool high value sort of thing. So I think it's nice that you've got a couple kind of immediate impact cards with Xerog's Crown and the Wand. Feels like those could maybe help you stabilize a little bit, because you're otherwise taking kind of a downturn with Marin. But do keep in mind, you still have to spend 3 mana on these, so that's either a 10 mana turn, or you take it down turn 7 perhaps, and then try to catch up a little bit on the next turn with like a Wondrous Wand plus whatever other thing. And then you've kind of got 2 more like value oriented things with the Kobold or the Goblet. The Kobold might be hard to play sometimes, and does technically offer a little tempo recovery too, as a 3-mana 6/6 taunt. Like, that feels pretty efficient to get down, so in desperation moments that might be all right. But ultimately, 3 good cards essentially added to your deck, and 1, you know, nice thing in a pinch. The Wand too, of course, can draw the 3 things that shuffle into your deck theoretically, right? Like, if you happen to play this on an empty deck or got crazy lucky, you could get 3 0-cost treasures back. The Goblet could, of course, also hit a treasure as well. Like, the Toland's Goblet could hit the Xerog's Crown, which, you know, that could be an absolutely crazy sort of thing to roll into. So there are some interesting interactions there, since you're choosing the treasure and then playing it later on that delay. They'll already be shuffled in. But, you know, I think with Reno decks in particular, we see a lot of strong Reno decks that are playing kind of slow, kind of greedy, late game sorts of cards, that Marin the Manager actually has a home in those sort of environments. I think this does have enough payoff that this becomes a pretty interesting card in those homes. You know, obviously outside of that, I think it's going to be really hard to make this work. Any faster decks probably won't have time. Even any kind of mid-rangey decks, of which there are quite a few these days, things like, you know, Hand Buff Paladin and so on, probably wouldn't find the room to spend this much mana to get all of this stuff moving. But a Reno deck can probably tolerate that, particularly one that's more defensively minded, has some health totals to fall back on. This is also a Battle Cry, which could be relevant for Warrior in particular, doubling that Battle Cry, getting even more fantastic treasures. The only challenge is really like, is this better than all of the other crazy things that Reno decks are already doing? Like, they already have so many great late game bombs and win conditions that this does sort of have to outcompete those. I don't know that that will always be true, but I think there's probably a deck or two that can sustain this sort of thing. And the upsides, particularly for Wand and Crown, and knowing that you'll be able to get those when you play Marin, there's no risk that you miss. You're gonna hit those. Probably does make this pretty intriguing and playable in that Reno deck world which we live in today. So moving on to our next card, this one's gonna take a little bit of explanation. This is a new mechanic. As you'll see here with this keyword on buttons, it's called Shaman Tourist. And what that means is when you add buttons to your deck as a Death Knight, he's a Death Knight card, you put him in Death Knight decks, you're gonna have access to Shaman's cards from this expansion. So kind of like dual class cards, but you'll note they are not symmetrical. Shaman will not have access to Death Knight cards. In fact, here are the class pairings. You can see there in the 4th spot, Death Knight is vacationing in Shaman, but Shaman is vacationing in Demon Hunter. So also note that although you'll be able to add the class cards from Shaman to Death Knight decks, you will not be able to add the Tourist for Shaman, thereby creating a chain, because if you could just, of course, access every class's cards in your deck. So basically, of the 10 cards that are released for Shaman, you'll get the 9 that are not the Tourist accessible to Death Knight decks. So basically, Shaman cards playable in Death Knight as long as they're from the Perils in Paradise expansion, and presumably the upcoming mini set as well. This is the chart that Blizzard provided. I actually think it's almost more helpful to kind of look at this backwards. So for instance, if you start in the top row, Rogue cards will be in Paladin decks, and Warlock cards will be in Rogue decks, and Death Knight cards will be in Warlock decks. Like, I would almost flip the arrows in this case for my help. And I will say, throughout the reviews this expansion, I'm going to include an icon at the bottom which will show you the second class that a card can be played in. So we know that this is the Shaman Tourist. Death Knight is going to be in Shaman, which means Shaman cards, like the Molten Magma here that we'll talk about, are going to be available in Death Knight decks. That little icon there is a reminder. This card is not only going to be played in Shaman, but also potentially played in Death Knight as well. And I'll just go ahead and show you another example here. We have the Paladin Legendary that is a Rogue Tourist, which of course means that Rogue cards will be playable in Paladin as long as they're from the Perils in Paradise expansion, and they're not the Rogue Tourist. To give you an example of that, here is Petty Theft, a Rogue card, again featuring the Paladin icon below it to showcase that it is indeed also playable in Paladin, assuming you're running the Sunsapper Lanessa in your deck. Now, from a practical standpoint, what I think that means is that pretty much all of the tourist cards, these legendaries that enable you that cross-class functionality, they seem like they're almost locks to get played, because you have to imagine just having access to 9 additional cards. 1 or 2 of those almost have to be worth it, right? For any given class, you're going to want access to that other, other classes' legendary or unique mechanics. And it looks like, in fact, a lot of these things will sort of almost be designed around the tourist effect as well. Like, we've got Sunsapper Lanessa cares about cards that cost 2 or less. The Rogue card that might fit into Paladin costs 2 or less and gives you things that cost 2 or less. So there are just going to be, it seems, some very natural synergistic elements paired up through all these tourists, and just having access to that many more cards in the pool, you just imagine there's going to be decks that use these. So I think unless the tourist just has some like crazy high prohibitive cost or some sort of notable downside, which I don't envision, I just think all of these are going to be like 4-star cards at a minimum, and then occasionally 5-star cards, if they have really strong sort of effects. So looking at buttons specifically, this is a 5-mana 5/5 undead for Death Knight. Battlecry, draw a spell of each spell school. Now, what's interesting about this effect is that we know Death Knight as a rainbow class. We have Rainbow Death Knight, it's been a good deck. But that refers to the runes, right? We have the 3 different colors of runes, whereas we have Rainbow Mage, which refers to all the various spell schools. And this card could kind of fuse those 2 titles together, giving access to Death Knight being more of a Rainbow Spell School sort of deck. Because right now, Death Knight pretty much only has Shadow and Frost spells, which wouldn't make buttons terrible. Like, just drawing two spells is not a disaster necessarily for this card. But when you gain access to Shaman cards, and we saw, for instance, Malted Magma, here is a fire spell you can put in your Death Knight decks now. And we've seen plenty of 5/5s drawing stuff, the Magatha kind of option, but this does not have that downside necessarily of something like Magatha. And in fact, the fact that it's showing spells is probably a huge upside, because you're getting, maybe a burst damage assortment, maybe a mix of like single target removal, AoE removal, and burst damage, and those sorts of things. You can construct the deck to actually make this a huge benefit, making sure you're hitting the things you need with extra reliability. So between the fact that this gives you access to Shaman cards, A+ effect, and this just has crazy efficient specific sorts of draws, I think Buttons looks like an absolutely nuts card. I just think this is going to be really good and show up in a vast array of Death Knight decks. Yeah, this just looks super strong to me. This is an easy pick for a very powerful card. So let's move on to the other tourist card here. We're going to be kind of bouncing around between classes and stuff. This is Sun Sapper Linessa, a 5-mana 2/6 for Paladin. In this case, your spells that cost 2 or less cast twice. So any small little buffs or card draw effects or whatever it might be are going to go off multiple times. So, I was looking like Flash of Light, like boom, okay, cool. I get to restore 8 and draw 2 cards for 2 mana. Like, that actually feels pretty good. You got little buffs, Hand of Adal and stuff. Okay, this suddenly, again, nice little 2-part buff and a couple cards drawn. Remember that auras can stack now. You got like Resistance Aura. Your opponent's spells now cost 2 more for multiple turns. These sorts of things, all seem to make sense for Linessa. And importantly, since this is a rogue tourist, which means rogue cards from Perils in Paradise will be playable in Paladin, we're going to see stuff like Petty Theft. This is a 2-mana spell that gets you 2 random 1-cost spells from other classes. So when you're playing this in Paladin, that means this is going to go off twice if you have Linessa on board. And that means you're going to get 4 1-cost spells from other classes. Each of those is also going to be able to go off twice if you have Linessa on board. So you could create this kind of chain of events that goes absolutely crazy. Now, perhaps most important of all is that this is a tourist card. I think that's going to make this very naturally super interesting. Just being able to run rogue cards is probably going to make this worth the slot in your deck, giving you access to all of those extra tools and perhaps unique mechanics that otherwise Paladin wouldn't have access to. So I think, again, this is probably just going to get played on that basis alone. As far as the effect, I do think this one's a little slower. It takes this sort of 5 cost up front to get Linessa in play, and then you start playing these spells that, potentially take up to 2 mana, like you're looking at a 7-mana turn, a 9-mana turn, to start weaving all this together. If you talk about Petty Theft, you got 5 into 2 into 1/1/1, you have to make up enough of that cost difference to kind of overcome the fact that you played a 5-mana 2/6. Now, Rogue does tend to have some pretty spicy, cheap spells to help fuel that, but remember, we're not looking at things like Preparation, because Preparation is not from Perils in Paradise. You can't run any rogue card. You have to run the ones from this set specifically. So that might end up limiting what is possible. You can't just imagine all the cool backstabs and shadow steps and stuff in the world. That's not going to be available. It's just Perils in Paradise cards. So that does seem like a little bit of a limiter that would potentially hold this back. That said, again, I think because it's a tourist card, even if you don't care that much about this sort of effect, you just toss it into your deck. You sacrifice that slot for that upside. Think about like Gen and Baku. You were happy to have a dead card in hand because it allowed you to do something extra and cool. Very relevant reference, as Gen and Baku are now back in Hearthstone as of today in standard format. So you sacrifice that slot, you get your rogue cards, you're happy. And then as long as you have a few things in deck that occasionally allow you to benefit from this, that might be all you need. You don't necessarily have to have some home run turn off of this. So I'm not saying that the card is bad because it's hard to get that home run turn together. I'm just saying don't expect that home run turn to come together all that often. That's not what you're excited about necessarily for this. It might just be that it's a tourist card, and that alone makes it a pretty relevant choice. So let's move on over to another Paladin card here in the context of Linessa. This is a 3-mana 3/2 weapon that reads, after your hero attacks, get a 1-cost Sunscreen that gives +1/+2. Now, I didn't get graphics for Sunscreen, but I'm assuming that is a a non-typed spell that is just a buff. A nice little 1/2 buff, which, as we know, you can save a couple of those up in hand. You play your Linessa, you can give this, basically 2/4 in stats for each sunscreen. That could help kind of like keep this alive maybe for multiple turns, allowing you to set up for that home run the following turn. So, you turn this into a 3/8, and then you turn this into a 4/10 for 7 mana. Still not the strongest on-board play, but a possibility. I think more likely is that you're just using these buffs to kind of, throw up the board or push for damage. Now, I will say, comparing Volley Maul to stuff like Painter's Virtue right now in hand buff Paladins, this does feel a little bit slower and lower impact, because Painter's Virtue is giving every card in your hand +1/+1 for 3 swings. So, that can very often result in like 15 in total stats or something, right? You have like 5 minions in hand, each getting +3/+3. Plus, you have the lifesteal on that. It is more expensive at 4 mana, but still, this is ultimately only giving you 2 buffs that you have to, again, actually spend the mana on because they cost 1. So that just feels way slower than what Paladin is doing now. I mean, I guess if you need the 3/2 weapon to like keep up against really aggressive starts, kill some early 3 health stuff from your opponent, there are some small advantages there, but I can't really see this card outpassing just the craziness that hand buff Paladin offers right now. It is basically the best or one of the top decks in the game. I just don't see this punching is heavy in Paladin. Now, interestingly, remember, this is actually going to be a mage card as well. As you can see here from the icon at the bottom, mage is going to be touristing in Paladin, which means this card can be added to mage decks, giving mage access to a weapon that can just kind of like go face and maybe support minions. There's something interesting there. It's different than mage can normally do. So that's something to keep in mind. I don't know that mage will necessarily have huge upsides or benefits from this kind of effect. They're not typically as minion based, particularly with all the no minion mage that exists right now. So they might have a hard time using these buff spells. I mean, they do still generate a lot of minions, I guess, but then also they have a weapon, the Cosmic Keyboard, that's really important to them. So they want to run something like Volley Maul. I don't really necessarily see that happening either. So maybe not the best fit in mage, but we'll see more mage cards. Maybe something interesting opens up there. I think slower and just lower output than what Paladin does today. So it's going to be hard for this card to compete. And I don't think the synergies with Linessa like create enough opportunity for this one to really stand out. So it's a 3/2 weapon. Those have historically been okay, but I just think Paladin has access to more and better. All right, so moving on to Petty Theft. This is a 2-mana spell for Rogue. Gives you 2 random 1-cost spells from other classes. And of course, we do see like Thief Rogue stuff available in standard format right now. Tess Greymane actually gets played a lot in standard in Mining Rogue because the Excavate Treasure Reward, of course, gives you access to lots of big, juicy, discounted spells. And that's where Petty Theft falls apart pretty fast for me when I compare this to the Excavate package and what that's doing so well. I just don't see how Petty Theft keeps up. All of those Excavate cards are giving you really high utility, cheap things in hand, especially once you get to the Scorpion Reward. You get sometimes crazy high utility stuff that's very affordable in hand. The Petty Theft is giving you affordable stuff, but it will often not be super high utility, and in fact might sometimes be kind of clunky or awkward because, some 1-cost spells will be very specific in their use cases or based on synergies that you don't necessarily utilize well. So you're paying this 2 mana upfront cost on Petty Theft to find things that just maybe aren't that good. You're kind of spending 4 mana to get 2 1-cost spells, and outside of, crazy bonuses like we talked about with Linessa, maybe copying those effects a ton, I just don't see how this is utilized all that well. I just think Rogue is doing much punchier, much faster, much more impactful things, getting cheap treasures and then going from there. So even in a kind of Thief Rogue world, I don't see this. 1-cost cards can be useful to Rogue, setting up combos, having chains of card effects going off, but there's lots of other ways for them to do that really effectively. So to me, this just doesn't keep up. Now in Paladin, I think it only really makes sense again in the context of Linessa getting duplicates, but like we talked about, that turning into a home run turn seems very awkward, very slow, and very expensive. So I don't really think this gets played in Paladin much either. It might be what it's designed for. It might be interesting and fun in that scenario, but it's just too much mana spent to get all of these kind of random things in hand that don't seem worth it. So I don't see a lot of potential for this in Rogue, frankly, and I don't see a lot of potential for this in Paladin either. So moving on over to Shaman. We teased this one earlier, and this is also a little bit of a cycle of cards in this expansion called Drinks. Drinks are basically like bananas or the barreled monkeys in Hunter, where they each have 3 uses, and you just play the first one, then you got two drinks left, then you're down to your last drink, and you can see that here. So Molten Magma in particular is a 2-mana spell that deals 1 damage to all enemies, and some relevance, it's a fire spell. Since it can be played in Death Knight, that helps support things like buttons by giving access to extra spell schools for him to draw. We're also going to see another card in Shaman here I'll tease as well that's going to reduce the cost of a spell of each school in your hand by 2. So keep in mind it is a 2-cost spell. This could be something that very reliably goes down to 0 thanks to the Cabaret Headliner. So this actually kind of has vibes of something like Aftershocks. Shaman card, most often played in Warrior these days, but that deals 1 damage 3 times, but it only costs 4 total, whereas this would cost 6 total, and that could also be discounted as well to cost less than that even. So ultimately, this is a much more expensive version of Aftershocks, but it has 2 differences. This does actually go face. This can be a little bit of extra chip damage, and it can technically be beneficial to sometimes be able to spread that damage out. So, you know, if there's a bunch of 3 health stuff, you can go all in on this and spend 6 and probably feel pretty bad about that and feel like it was inefficient. Alternatively, though, if there's just a board of 1/1s, you only need to tidy up some 1/1s because you're playing like, some Silverhand recruits or whatever, then you only have to use the first half and you get to kind of save some of that value back, save some of that upside to clear the next board of 1/1s or whatever. So against certain sort of token reload strategies, this could actually be advantage that you can spread it out. Now, on top of that, of course, we also have access to spell damage. We've seen plenty of like Nature Shaman, spell damage stuff, Novice Zapper sort of lines, and Molten Magma, since it can go face, does become pretty interesting with spell damage as another way to punch a ton of damage out, because if this just said deal 3 to all enemies, spell damage would only scale that once, but because this is 3 different spells, that means spell damage is going to hit each of them incrementally, and you'll get 3 extra damage out of a single spell damage effect, assuming you cast all 3 of these. So there are some interesting angles there as well for some spell damage. So upsides on this, spell school interactions could be very important. Spell damage interactions that can push face damage could be pretty important. And I think this does offer quite a bit of utility in that case. Even when you look at it as a board clear, it sometimes looks inefficient. There are a couple different angles there to consider that might give this that edge it needs to find relevance, particularly in that sort of rainbow environment where you just need good playable fire spells, maybe even a Death Knight. This looks like a pretty cool option. So I think reasonable in Death Knight with buttons might just be a card you want to run because it's a free draw off buttons, and then also reasonable in Shaman with some of their upsides as well. So moving on here to the Cabaret Headliner, a 4-mana 3/3 Naga. Battlecry reduced the cost of a spell of each school in your hand by 2. So this could be some really substantial discounts. Just looking at it in Shaman organically, we typically see 3 spell schools in Shaman: Nature, Frost, and Fire. There's also sometimes like some Shadow and stuff that pops up, those occasional random extra ones, but typically 3 spell schools would mean a 6-cost discount for the Cabaret Headliner, which of course for a 4-cost card, that's definitely going to pay back with a net mana gain when you play the Cabaret Headliner. That's intriguing. I don't know if that necessarily makes a ton of sense for Shaman right now, but it's enough of a discount that it sets up for some interesting combo potential. You're trying to push like face damage by getting stuff cheaper. We just saw the fire spell that can go face, having that discounted, for instance. So I am honestly intrigued by that. Like, you also can stack 2 of these, right? So just play a couple of these and have some really expensive cards reduced really significantly. We already sometimes see the Jazz base card being used to discount the Jive Insect in order to set up some combos and stuff. This could be a way to just like discount Jive Insect pretty reliably, if you only have a select number of things in hand that you're trying to target. So I would definitely keep that in mind as a combo enabler, but also sometimes just like a tempo recovery tool. Play this on 4, have like a big turn 5, big turn 6 sort of thing by either cheating out big spells, Wish Upon a Star. You could play on turn 5 because this is an arcane spell. This is kind of a 4th bonus option. I think again there's a shadow spell as well, so it's like 5 total things, but this is going to be the only arcane spell in your hand as a Shaman. So play Headliner on 4, Wish Upon a Star, cheat it out on turn 5. Like, that's pretty interesting. Suddenly you're off to the races with some big buffs. moving into the late game. Now, more importantly, perhaps though, I think this is just absolutely insane with our friend we saw earlier, buttons in Death Knight. You know, this is our Shaman Tourist in Death Knight. Draw a spell of each spell school. So you're gonna have a bunch of these spell schools in hand, probably 3 from Death Knight and potentially a couple more from Shaman. Now, again, it's only Perils in Paradise cards that you can use for your tourist card, so we don't know exactly what spell schools will be available, but this kind of teases they're going to have multiples. So Malted Magma is at the very least a fire spell, adding another option to Death Knight. So, you know, you could play a buttons and then have the Cabaret Headliner in your deck, because this is playable in Death Knight, and then just discount that hand of stuff that you just drew off buttons, right? So having some kind of rainbow package in Death Knight almost makes more sense than in Shaman. I will also say, keep in mind that Shaman is going to have access to Demon Hunter cards. So we see here the chart, Demon Hunter cards playable in Shaman there in that 5th slot. Shaman is touristing into Demon Hunter. It's kind of a confusing chart, I know, again. So there could be access to things like Fell spells in Shaman that we normally wouldn't otherwise have. So some Fell spells that deal like face damage, for instance, alongside some Fire spells that deal face damage, Nature spells that deal face damage. You've got yourself a chain of discounts effectively going off. Who knows how much damage you could discount for some kind of crazy, lethal combo push. But we don't know the Demon Hunter cards yet, so it's kind of hard to say what might be available. Again, it's not all Demon Hunter cards, it's just Perils in Paradise Demon Hunter cards. Will there be a Fell spell that goes face in Demon Hunter? You know, we'll have to wait and see, but definitely a possibility for this card. We'll have to keep an eye out on Demon Hunter stuff. So moving on to the Corpsicle here. This is a 2-mana Death Knight spell. It's a single Frost rune. Now, this is also going to be playable in Warlock. Warlock will be touristing in Death Knight, so keep that in mind. And the runes, apparently, I'm told, will be relevant. So if you add this to your deck in Warlock, you are going to have rune considerations, because, of course, you'll have access to multiple Death Knight cards. So if there's like a triple unholy Death Knight card that shows up in this expansion, for instance, you would not be able to play that alongside Corpsicle in your Warlock deck. You'll have to still respect the rune rules. But this spell looks pretty interesting, right? Deal 3, spend 3 corpses to return this to your hand at the end of your turn. It's very reminiscent of something like Frozen Touch, that old mage spell from Nathria that would deal 3, and then if you had it infused, it would add another one to your hand. The important difference here is that this is an end of turn return effect. That is a confusing sentence to say. So you can't like just weave this together for, multiple instances all at once. This is more something you're going to kind of weave in every turn that you can. So, use it to clean up a 3/3 early, and then, just get some chip damage with that extra spare mana. Think of it almost like a hero power you can kind of hit turn after turn, as long as you have those corpses to spend to make sure it's returning, which for Death Knight, as we know, is not going to be a huge problem. They have tons of bodies to throw around. They like spinning corpses as well for Rainbow Death Knight with the Necrotic Explosion. Warlock maybe doesn't have quite as much good token stuff to generate those corpses, but still sometimes, some imp-based decks, some Zooey-style decks will get bodies down and be able to fuel this. So I think this looks really interesting in Death Knight. Perfect fit for Rainbow decks in particular. Probably has some utility in Warlock as well. Just having that extra reach in face damage in a minion-based deck might be pretty nice, and they might get access to some ways to make extra bodies as well in this expansion as we see more and more Death Knight cards. All right, so next up we have a new location for Druid. This is Hiking Trail. It's 3 mana. It allows you to discover a taunt minion, and after you gain armor, you get to reopen this. So that is kind of a new mechanic. It's going to exist for locations, it sounds like, in this expansion, whereas normally they have that down turn. You use it, then it's off for a turn, and then you get to use it again the following turn. Now, if you activate this thing, you can reopen it during its down turn. So theoretically, you could use this like 3 straight turns, as long as you're gaining armor on that down turn. And as a druid, hero power gives you armor. This is also going to be usable in Warrior, because Warrior is going to be touristing. Is touristing a word? Warrior's going to be visiting Druid with their tourist. So also a potential Warrior card. As we know, of course, Warrior can gain lots of armor. The question for me on this one is discovering a taunt minion going to be worth it? I don't know if that seems like it. It's, 3 instances of value. That's kind of cool. But I don't really want to necessarily spend 3 on just randomly discovered things. I don't know if the upside is going to be worth it. I feel like Hearthstone is so synergistic and so driven with its game plans these days that like randomly discovered stuff over a 3-turn delay, I just don't think it's going to be worth it, man. I think there's just better things for Druid and Warrior to be doing. Feels like this one's going to be a pretty easy cut. Maybe there will be some like super taunt synergies, but we've seen that so much in Warrior. It's so many ways to discover and generate taunts that just never really felt worth it. Sometimes it doesn't feel as bad if it's like attached to a taunt and a body that you can kind of get some tempo rolling. You know, the classic turtle guy whose name I can't remember despite having played him 1,000 times in my life. You know, but this doesn't have that. This is just a value generator. It doesn't offer you any tempo up front or delay or that sort of speed bump that interrupts your opponent. So to me, I think this just looks really, really slow, but it does, you know, tease this idea of reopening locations, which could be a pretty interesting mechanic, assuming the effect is more valuable and worthwhile. So this next card is a new neutral legendary that, boy, this one looks not great. Let's say that. It is AFK. It is a 5 mana 0/5, and she reads, at the end of your turn, give all other friendly minions that didn't attack +2/+2. So there are definitely a few ways this can be impactful and get some stats, right? Number one is like you have a board you choose not to attack with, build a big board on turn 4 and play AFK on turn 5 and choose stats over attacks, right? Just like normal minions. Number two is like you play cards out alongside AFK. So you play her and then you summon a bunch of tokens all at once. You know, some spell like Priest has the like fireflies or lightning bugs or whatever, you know, in the bottle that they summon a bunch of 1/1s really affordably, and they all gain +2/+2, and you've used AFK to kind of, you know, support that board. Maybe the same thing in like Hunter, I don't know, like the hounds and stuff. So that's another way. Third way, I guess, is like frozen boards. Your board got frozen, you're mad at your opponent for freezing your board, so you slam AFK to punish them for freezing your board. And the fourth way, I guess, is cards that don't really want to attack. You know, classic like Ragnaros, the Fire Lord example, where it doesn't care about attacking, and maybe you just want to shore up its stats so that you know, it's more likely to survive or whatever. Although giving it plus attack seems weird in that instance. Why would you care if it's not intending to attack? Anyway, so I think those are all the examples where this is kind of a card that does something, but none of those sound very good to me. The best is like summoning the board all at once, but I have to imagine, like, I don't know, man, like a 5 cost card that's giving +2/+2. Is that really better than some of the like buffs and survivability stuff we've seen before? All the like wide board supports and buffs and stuff. I'm thinking about like Hunter, as you know, had like Saddle Up. That's a great way to support a wide board. The RC Rampage just builds the stats itself sometimes, right? You don't need the extra support from AFK. Druid historically has had a ton of really efficient buffs. I mean, yes, in theory, she can survive through multiple turns and kind of do it again, but that's not likely to happen. Importantly, she doesn't even buff herself. I feel like it would have been a freebie to make this a 2/7 at the end of the turn, right? But it's all other friendly minions. So she's not even buffing herself in this case to kind of make herself stronger and more survivable. So despite there being, you know, scenarios where this makes sense, I just don't really see this getting played. I'm curious how you guys intend to use this, because to me, it just doesn't feel like it's doing what Hearthstone wants you to do these days, which is be aggressive and push and be faster. This feels like slow and grindy, but in the wrong way, not for value or win conditions. It's slow and grindy for like board presence that's kind of middling. So I just don't see it with AFK. Moving on to the Weapons Attendant. This is a new 6 mana 6/4 pirate. He's got a battle cry here. If you control another pirate, equip a random weapon from your deck. So this is teasing, I think, some of the pirate synergies that are probably going to pop up in this set. It teased that there are going to indeed be a lot of pirates floating around on this one, and this is pretty expensive for what we normally expect pirate decks to do. Those have often historically been much faster and more aggressive, but I will say this does actually do a lot. It's basically drawing a weapon, and if it's a big expensive weapon, which there aren't a ton of those that get played right now in Hearthstone, but you know, even a 4-5 mana weapon getting drawn and put into play for free is pretty nice. It's a tutor, and it's saving you the mana all at once, and you're getting a 6/4 body with it as well, right? So if you cheat something 5 mana into play off this, you're kind of getting a 1 mana 6/4 to go alongside it. There is that downside that you have to have another pirate on board, which sometimes means, you know, you might have to spend like 7 mana, for instance, to make this work. If you've got a pirate left over from a previous turn, of course you can play this on 6, but a lot of boards in Hearthstone these days do get cleaned up, particularly in the mid game, or you're kind of racing to the win anyway. But I will say too, this can just lead to damage, right? And if you have another pirate on board and you're looking for a little bit of extra reach or that damage to close out a game, this turns into damage. You know, normally we look at these kind of expensive neutral cards and they don't seem to have a lot of promise because decks are just so refined and so synergistic. But I don't know, man. I could see this being the finisher of sorts for some pirate decks that can afford to push into the mid game, a little bit more mid-rangey sort of stuff. Even like Paladin, as we see right now, sometimes has that little pirate package in it with the South Sea deckhands. Has some nice weapons, sometimes with Painter's Virtue. Like, could this be a Paladin pirate deck? It's a possibility, right? As long as you have a good weapon you're looking to find reliably, Weapons Attendant lets you do that. Moving on here to the Drink Server. This is a 2-mana 2/2 Murloc, and once again a pirate. Death Rattle, get a random drink spell. So we saw the Shaman drink earlier. It's really hard to know exactly how good these drink spells are going to be on average, but I will say this is just a lot of stuff. Sometimes it's nice, particularly in things like Highlander decks, just have ways to generate things to do. And this is a nice little thing to do on turn 2 that's often going to give you a way to fill in some gaps and mana as well in the mid-game turns, because, you know, none of these drinks we expect to be like big 7-8 cost cards or anything. We think most of them are going to be fairly cheap to mid-game at the most. So, you know, sometimes just filling in 2 or 3 mana here or there, 1 mana here and there, can give you that little bit of extra depth in a deck that just needs to even off some of the rough edges on your mid-game turns. So I wouldn't be totally shocked if this pops into some Highlander decks here and there. I don't know that this would necessarily be worth it in Pirate or Murloc decks that would traditionally want to be a little bit more aggressive. I suspect not all the drinks will be aggressive. Some of those might feel like a downside. But decks that are playing a little bit more loose and just trying to kind of get by until they're hitting those late-game power cards, something like this could fill in rather well. And then finally, moving on to the Travel Agent here. This is another 2-mana 2/2. This time, Battlecry, discover a location from any class. And a lot of things said about the last card could be kind of true for the Travel Agent, but at the same time, this won't have that sort of mana filling utility, because the Drink Server, you know, is giving you a card that has 3 different uses. All the drinks are going to have 3 uses, so you can use those to kind of fill in multiple times. The location's going to be a one-time sort of thing that you play. I will also say that locations, they're very synergistic in many cases. There are so many locations, like we just saw the Druid location, right? Like, a lot of classes don't want to discover top minions, don't have armor to reopen. That wouldn't be a good fit. And I suspect even though you're discovering, there will still be a handful of times where you get 3 options that just aren't that helpful to a given game state or situation and might be hard to use. So there will be the occasional home run that lines up, but most of the time I bet this whiffs and makes this card a little bit hard to use, even in things like Highlander decks. I don't know if this offers enough kind of flexibility essentially to be a good option. All right, so that wraps it up for all the reviews. So now let's do some quick reviews. Marin the Manager is a 4-star card. Buttons is a 5-star card. Malted Magma is a 4-star card. Cabaret Headliner is a 4-star card. Sunsapper Lanessa is a 4-star card. Petty Theft is a 2-star card. Volley Mull is a 2-star card. Corpsicle is a 4-star card. Hiking Trail is a 2-star card. AFK is a 1-star card, I think. I don't see it. Weapons Attendant is a 4-star card. Drink Server is a 3-star card. Travel Agent is a 2-star card. Yeah, and there you go. Those are the Perils in Paradise reveal cards. I think some pretty interesting stuff. The tourist mechanic is going to be really wild. It's kind of like dual class, but, you know, making them non-symmetrical is perhaps a little more confusing in some cases, but also might open up some different design space. Also importantly, you know, they're not going to be like discoverable and stuff, so you can't just discover Shaman cards Death Knight. Maybe that creates some opportunities for design as well. But all in all, it's gonna be fun, dude. Like, playing rogue cards and paladins, pretty cool. I haven't really looked through the other pairings just yet to see some really interesting stuff, but like hunter cards and priest, like we'll get some damage maybe in priest, some aggression, right? Warrior cards and hunter, maybe you'll get some armor gain and life gain in hunter. That could be kind of a spicy angle. Mage in druid, maybe druid will get some fireball action to kill people with. Oh boy, they need that for their spell damage cards. God, I'm suddenly very scared. So definitely some intriguing pairings we'll have to talk more about as we see more of those cards. Hopefully this little icon down here is helpful to remind you guys where these cards will be seen, not just in druid but also in warrior, for instance. So all in all, curious to hear your thoughts on these cards. Which ones are your favorites? Can you find something to do for AFK? Share all those thoughts and more down in the comments below. Thanks much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.